They never saw the planes coming, not in the quiet hour before dawn, not in the proud winter morning when Tokyo believed the war was already won. But on that day in 1942, as the sirens wailed over a city that had never imagined fear, Japan discovered a truth it was not prepared to face. The Americans were only beginning to fight. The war had moved swiftly across the Pacific, too swiftly, some whispered inside the Japanese high command. Victories in the Philippines, Malaya, Hong Kong, and the Dutch East Indies had created an illusion of inevitability. Streets in Tokyo echoed with confidence. Newspapers declared destiny. Admirals spoke of conquest measured in months, not years. But beneath that triumph, a question lingered, one that only a handful of leaders dared to voice. What happens when a nation built on industry, endurance, and sheer resolve decides to rise from its greatest defeat? The answer arrived not as an armada, not as an invasion, but as a handful of B-25 bombers carving their way across the Pacific, a mission so improbable that even its pilots expected not to return. A strike so small that it barely scratched the city it hit, yet shook an empire to its core. Because sometimes history turns not on the size of a blow, but on what it forces a nation to see. The Pacific in early 1942 was a map stamped by Japanese victories. From the shores of Malaya to the ruins of Manila, the imperial banners rose with astonishing speed. To the outside world, it looked like a new empire being carved in months, a campaign so swift that even seasoned analysts in Washington and London struggled to comprehend how completely the balance of power had shifted. Inside Japan's command circles, however, the mood was more complicated. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor strike, understood better than most what the empire had awakened. He had studied in the United States, he had walked American streets, seen its factories, and respected its industrial potential. Victories could be won quickly, yes, but wars of endurance were another matter, and the United States, he warned, excelled at endurance. Yet Japan celebrated as if the war were already decided. Reports from the Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies painted a picture of unstoppable advance. Troops moved with practiced precision. Airfields fell one after another. Supply lines seemed secure. The Imperial General Staff spoke openly about expanding deeper into the Pacific, into Australia, into the Indian Ocean, anywhere momentum pointed them. But Yamamoto knew momentum was not a plan, and victory was not a guarantee. Within Tokyo's highest councils, rival visions clashed. Army firebrands demanded further expansion, convinced that America was soft, incapable of sustaining a long war. Their confidence grew with each broadcast praising the empire's conquests. In their eyes, hesitation was weakness. Yamamoto stood on the other side of that divide. He insisted that Japan had 18 months no more to force a negotiated settlement. Every additional front opened, every distant island seized, drained the precious resources Japan could not replenish. Oil reserves, shipyards, trained pilots, these were not infinite. He warned that after the initial wave of triumph, the empire would be overstretched, exposed, and vulnerable. But caution in wartime Tokyo was a dangerous virtue. Friends worried that open dissent could cost Yamamoto his life. Some urged him to stay aboard his flagship, the Yamato, where the reach of political extremists could not easily find him. Even there, the admiral worked under the weight of a reality few wanted to acknowledge. Japan had woken a nation far larger and far more capable than its early victories suggested. While Japan debated its future, the United States faced its own reckoning. Pearl Harbor had torn through America's sense of security, but the carriers survived, and in those decks lay the seeds of a new kind of war. Factories roared to life. Training programs accelerated. What the nation lacked in immediate strength, it compensated with resolve. But America needed something more than preparation. It needed a spark and act bold enough to tell the world that the United States was not beaten. That spark would come from a plan so daring it bordered on impossible. Launching land-based bombers from a carrier to strike the Japanese home islands. A mission with long odds, no guarantees, and no clear path home. Yet it was precisely the kind of mission that could shift the moral weight of a war. And it would. The raid reached Tokyo in minutes, but its shockwaves traveled much farther. When Jimmy Doolittle's B-25 bombers lifted off the USS Hornet and struck the Japanese mainland, the physical damage was limited, but the psychological impact was seismic. For the first time in centuries, the Japanese homeland had been breached. Sirens echoed through neighborhoods that had believed themselves untouchable. Civilians scrambled for shelter. The myth of invulnerability, nurtured by months of triumph, cracked in a single morning. Inside Japan's military command, the response was immediate and visceral. The raid was not simply an embarrassment, it was an omen. Yamamoto understood what it signified. If a handful of American aircraft could penetrate the home islands now, what would they be capable of in a year? 2 years? And if the Americans were bold enough to attempt such a mission so early in the war, what ferocity would they unleash once their full industrial might came online? This realization ignited the most consequential strategic shift of the Pacific War. Japan's leadership felt compelled to respond with a decisive blow, something so spectacular it would restore confidence at home and intimidate the United States into negotiating. Yamamoto proposed the operation he believed would achieve this, a sweeping ambush near a small atoll the world barely knew. Midway. The logic was simple: lure the remaining American carriers into a trap, crush them, and slam the Pacific door shut before the United States could rebuild. It would be a replay of Pearl Harbor, but this time on Yamamoto's terms. Powerful fleet carriers, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers were assembled for the operation. Thousands of sailors prepared for what many believed would be the culminating battle of the war. Yet the very urgency created by the Doolittle raid also led to mistakes. Japan rushed the plan. Intelligence estimates were optimistic. Communications grew fragmented. Key units were dispatched simultaneously to the Aleutians in a diversion that diluted strength. The empire was stretching itself thin at the moment it most needed cohesion. Across the ocean, the United States was reading signals, literally. Cryptanalysts at Station Hypo had broken critical portions of Japan's naval code. They knew Midway was the target. They knew the timing. And they understood that this was the opportunity America had been waiting for. When the battle came in June 1942, it unfolded with chaotic intensity. American dive bombers descended on Japanese carriers at the precise moment their decks were cluttered with refueling aircraft and armed torpedoes. In less than an hour, 3 of Japan's frontline carriers were aflame. The 4th followed soon after. A single, desperate strike by Doolittle's raiders, small in scale, almost symbolic, had set off a chain reaction that tore apart the core of Japan's naval aviation. Midway was more than a defeat. It was a strategic amputation. 4 carriers gone, hundreds of elite pilots lost, irreplaceable mechanics and deck crews wiped out. Japan's offensive momentum, built over months, stalled in a single week. And into that vacuum of power, a new battle would soon emerge. One fought not in the open ocean but on a remote island where jungle, rain, and sheer will would test every soldier who touched its shores. That place was Guadalcanal. Approximately 500 words. Turning points and consequences. The shift, the failures, the human and material costs. The aftermath of Midway did not bring clarity to the Japanese high command. Instead, it produced a silence that concealed the scale of the disaster. News of the 4 lost carriers was restricted to the highest naval circles. Officers in the field, soldiers on distant islands, and even many senior commanders continued to believe the operation had been a success. This illusion carried Japan forward into one of the most difficult campaigns of the war. With the carrier force damaged but not fully acknowledged as crippled, Japan accelerated its push southward. The plan was bold and, on paper, logical. By seizing New Guinea and the Solomon Islands, Japanese forces could sever the lifeline between the United States and Australia. If Australia were isolated, Allied operations in the Pacific would collapse into logistical strain. It was a strategy that sought to regain momentum through geography and pressure, even as Japan was losing its irreplaceable naval aviation strength. The center of this strategy became a remote island with thick jungles, rising ridges, and a patch of coastline large enough to host a new airfield. That island was Guadalcanal. To Japan, the airfield promised dominance over the shipping lanes that fed Australia. To the United States, the same airfield represented a threat that could not be ignored. When American reconnaissance confirmed its construction in mid-1942, the implications were immediate. If Japan completed and defended the airfield, the Allies would face a hostile base directly on their supply route. Despite shortages of carriers, aircraft, trained crews, and amphibious experience, the United States decided to strike before the runway could become fully operational. The landings on Guadalcanal in August 1942 marked the first major American offensive of the Pacific War. For many of the Marines who stepped onto the beach, it was a moment of tense uncertainty. They had trained for this moment, but few had ever experienced combat. The jungle was thick, visibility limited, and the enemy silent. Yet within the first hours, American troops captured the unfinished airfield almost without resistance. That early success carried a dangerous temptation to underestimate the struggle ahead. Across the water, on the islands of Tulagi, Gavutu, and Tanambogo, the situation was far different. There, seasoned Japanese units fought with unyielding intensity. Defensive positions were carved into hillsides. Machine guns were positioned to create overlapping fields of fire. Snipers hid in trees, caves, and collapsed structures. Every movement forward demanded coordinated assaults, grenades, satchel charges, and constant alertness. Casualties rose sharply. The Marines began to understand that this would not be an easy campaign or a short one. Every ridge and ravine held danger. Every yard of ground required effort and sacrifice. As air battles erupted above the island and naval engagements flared in the surrounding waters, it became clear that Guadalcanal was no longer a limited operation. It was becoming a struggle for control of the entire southern Pacific. Supplies piled on beaches under constant threat. Pilots fought long missions with little rest. Sailors braced for night battles with an enemy skilled in darkness. Soldiers on the ground discovered the full cost of a campaign defined not by sweeping maneuvers, but by endurance, attrition, and the constant presence of danger. The consequences were profound. Guadalcanal forced Japan into a grinding contest it could not sustain. It forced the United States to adapt rapidly, learning amphibious warfare, jungle survival, and inter-service coordination under fire. And it revealed a truth that would shape the rest of the Pacific War. Victory would not come from quick strikes or single battles. It would come from resilience, from logistics, and from the willingness to withstand months of hardship in a place where nothing came easily. Approximately 400 words. American and global perspectives, strategic lessons, political reactions, and the changing course of the Pacific War. For the United States, Guadalcanal was more than a military operation. It was a declaration that the nation had moved beyond shock and recovery and had entered a new phase of determination. The early months after Pearl Harbor had been defined by defense, emergency measures, and the steady retreat of Allied positions across the Pacific. Guadalcanal changed that trajectory. It signaled that the United States was prepared not only to resist, but to seize the initiative, even when the balance of forces was still uncertain. American leaders understood what this shift meant. General Douglas MacArthur viewed the campaign as a lifeline to Australia, a guarantee that the Allies would retain a forward base indispensable to future operations. Admiral Chester Nimitz recognized Guadalcanal as a laboratory in which the Navy and Marine Corps were forced to adapt to new realities: integrated amphibious warfare, constant air pressure, and the complexities of fighting across thousands of miles of ocean. Each day on the island produced new lessons in logistics, coordination, and endurance. Within the broader Allied community, the reaction was equally significant. Australia, which had feared isolation after the fall of Singapore and the attacks on Darwin, saw Guadalcanal as tangible proof that the United States would commit its strength to the defense of the region. British observers, still recovering from setbacks in Asia, noted that American persistence on a remote island contrasted sharply with Japan's earlier momentum. Even far from the Pacific, in capitals across Europe, analysts marked the shift as evidence that the Axis offensive had finally reached its limit. Japan's response revealed a different perspective. While official broadcasts minimized the scale of the fighting, internal communications reflected growing concern. The loss of initiative was unmistakable. What had begun as a strategy to isolate Australia had become a defensive effort to hold ground that consumed ships, aircraft, and veteran troops. As the fighting intensified, Japanese commanders requested reinforcements that could not be spared. Naval officers began to worry about fuel supplies, aircrew shortages, and the increasing effectiveness of American intelligence. The Empire was discovering the cumulative weight of a long war it had not fully prepared to fight. The global significance of Guadalcanal lay not only in the battles themselves, but in what they represented. For the first time in the Pacific War, the Allies had halted a Japanese advance and forced the enemy into a prolonged struggle. The campaign exposed weaknesses in Japan's strategy and highlighted the strength of American industrial support, even in the early stages. It underscored that future victories would depend on patience, coordination, and the capacity to endure hardship as much as on bold tactics or sudden strikes. In this sense, Guadalcanal was a turning point not because it ended the war, but because it reshaped expectations. The world saw that the Allies could contest the initiative. Japan realized that early victories were not guarantees of long-term success, and the United States proved that it could carry the burden of a grinding campaign far from home, setting the foundation for the long road ahead. Approximately 400 words. Ending, historical legacy, emotional reflection, and CTA. The story of the Doolittle raid, Midway, and Guadalcanal is not simply a sequence of battles. It is a record of how small actions can redirect the course of a vast war, and how determination can turn doubt into forward momentum. The raid itself caused little physical damage, yet it became a catalyst, forcing Japan into choices that carried heavy consequences. Midway followed, reshaping the balance of naval power. Guadalcanal came next, demanding endurance, sacrifice, and a new understanding of what the Pacific War would require from those who fought it. For the Americans who landed on those beaches in 1942, the cost was measured not in strategy charts, but in long nights, heavy humidity, and the constant presence of danger. Many had never seen combat before stepping onto the island. By the time the campaign ended, they had lived through shortages, disease, sudden air raids, and the steady pressure of a determined enemy. Their experience became a foundation for everything that followed in the Pacific theater. They proved that the United States could fight on unfamiliar terrain, far from home, against a skilled and relentless opponent. For Japan, these events marked the end of the rapid advance that had defined the early war. They revealed the limits of momentum and exposed the strategic risk of misreading an opponent. The empire entered a new phase in which resources no longer stretched to meet ambition, and where each decision carried consequences that could not be hidden or reversed. The confidence that had defined the winter of 1942 gave way to the sobering reality that the war would not end quickly or on favorable terms. The legacy of these interconnected moments extends beyond the battlefield. They remind us that turning points often appear unexpectedly. A small raid can alter calculations, a lost carrier can reshape strategy. A remote island, barely known to most Americans, can become the stage on which a nation's resolve is tested and proven. These events taught future generations that power is not measured only in numbers, but in endurance, leadership, and the willingness to adapt in the face of hardship. As we look back, the question that remains is not only what happened, but what it meant. What do these battles tell us about the cost of war, the nature of courage, and the decisions that shape history? If this story made you think about the hidden turning points of the past, consider sharing your thoughts. What moment in this campaign stands out to you as the most decisive? And if you want to explore more stories that shaped the world we live in, join us for the next chapter in our journey through military history.